I always feel as if DOL AMROTH are the sort of force that I would have liked to see a little bit more of from the movies. They're certainly not the only faction within this game where that is the distinction, but I feel as though it's truly ever since I started playing Third Age and all of its variants and many of the Lord of the Rings games that I really started to miss the fact that DOL AMROTH were not in the movies, because they're a very stylish bunch and the lore behind them is pretty interesting as well. I know that Imrahil was technically there, but he was definitely a background character, certainly more so than he was in the books, where he played a little bit more of a central role as one of Gondor's principal allies at the time, of course, alongside the Rohirrim, who very much got the spotlight. And Dol Amroth, in terms of their position in Middle-earth as well, very close to Gondor, one of their client states, the most significant of them as well, when you consider that there are a few others as well, like Lasarnak and a few others a little bit further westward as well, as you skirt along the coastline of Middle-earth. But as a result, their lore is very much intertwined with the kingdom that they serve under. As far as their army in the game goes, I've already mentioned their style. They're one of my favourite looking factions, if not my favourite looking faction in the game as a whole. I remember way back in Vanilla when Gondor and Dol Amroth were one and the same. The Dol Amroth portion of the army was always my favourite looking part of it. And while the game has expanded a lot since then, it's certainly not as cut and dry anymore. Dol Amroth, especially with some of their updated unit models, which we'll have a look at a little bit later on, still can hold their own in the style department, certainly. But what can they actually do when it comes to taking to the field? What are they good at? What are they not so good at? Well, the first thing to mention is probably the most obvious thing, and that is their heavy cavalry, specifically heavy cavalry as well. When you compare it to the Rohirrim that we've already looked at, where it was more of a universal thing with their cav, they've got something for every occasion. They do lean some ways more than others, but with Dol Amroth, it is specifically their heavier units. All of the cavalry that they have access to has a focus around armour, being a little bit more survivable. Still having that damage, as we will see, Lance cavalry is something that they can prioritise if they so wish, which of course is primarily a damage dealing force. But having that slightly bulkier unit, or those slightly bulkier units that you can call upon, is pretty much universally a good thing, I would suggest, because all cavalry units tend to be pretty swift. Heavier cavalry isn't going to be quite as fast as some of the other units that you can find in the game, but generally speaking, lighter cavalry is going to want to use their speed to keep away from heavy cav, and you can do as you please, really. You can then take the initiative with these units. So if you had to pick between light or heavy cav in pretty much any Medieval 2 instance, I think you would go with heavy cav. So the fact that Dol Amroth is stronger in this regard is useful, and it does also mean that when it comes to cavalry engagements, Dol Amroth at the very least are going to be able to hold their own. Not necessarily win against certain forces if they go all out in that regard, but they can always be competitive and 9 times out of 10 be dominant in these situations. And the fact that they can also then do heavy damage to infantry forces as well with this kind of thing is an added bonus, really. And it's not just melee or lance cavalry, as we will see, but it does also extend to other aspects of mounted combat as well. But when it comes to fighting on foot, the main strength that you will find as Dol Amroth is another heavy kind of unit, they're heavy swordsmen. Heavy swordsmen will mean, for this case as well, two-handed swordsmen specifically. They have a good basic unit structure based around this, and it's where most of their damage is going to be coming from on foot. Dol Amroth are maybe not blessed in infantry terms quite so much as their Gondorian overlords, because they have fewer options, and just in general many of these options, as we'll go on to discuss in just a moment, are maybe not quite as efficient, but in this aspect specifically, they are superior. They're going to be able to do lots of base damage. They're going to be able to rely upon not only their armour, but also the fact that these kinds of units also have very high melee defense as well. It's the sort of thing which wouldn't look out of place in many of the elven factions, which makes a certain amount of sense when you look at the background of Dol Amroth. But a couple of units, bodyguard and mainline, that they can call upon here, and these kinds of units are going to be strong against the rank and file and going toe-to-toe with fellow higher-end units. And the final thing to take note of, I think, is, again, something more so on foot than on horseback, is going to be their armour-piercing support units. And this is kind of a specific thing, really. They have lost access, actually, to their pike unit, which is not unique to Dol Amroth. Many of the forces in the game have got access to either one kind of polearm unit or another. and Dol Amroth have retained their halberds specifically, which gives them an armour-piercing anchor unit, which was always the stronger of the two polearm units that Dol Amroth had. Their pikes were far more basic, but it did at least give them that longer range in melee option should they need it, but now they're going to have to rely on their halberds more to do that. But it's their other armour-piercing support unit on foot where you can actually counteract pikes a little bit more easily than other factions anyway, without having to resort to some sort of ground war, and that's their javelins, because the Belfalas Marines are not too outstanding when you consider them as a singular unit, very similar to basic javelins from other human factions, but the red limit on them is significantly higher than what you will find from many other factions, which means you can rely upon them as being a central part of your army a little bit more so, which is very useful in an attacking or a defensive siege, but it's also going to be useful for breaking up those slightly more awkward blocks of infantry should it come down to that, because Dol Amroth, while they do have strong infantry, as we've already mentioned, they do have some shortcomings in that area. If you just go for a straight up, full pedal to the metal brawl, they won't necessarily come out on top against some of the higher quality factions in the game if you do that. But if you do lean on some of these support units, especially against the more heavily armoured forces of Middle-earth, then you can definitely have some success there. But when it comes to some of their downsides, as I've already mentioned, we will be talking about an aspect of their infantry which does stand out, especially when you compare them directly to Gondor, which is the most obvious comparison to make, and that is that they have lower than average numbers, and across the whole faction this is true, because you're going to dip into cavalry a little bit more, which does reduce the size of your army overall because of cost and unit size of such units. But the lower than average numbers also extends to individual units, and this is most apparent in their line infantry unit, which has 20 or so men less than some of the other kingdoms of men that you may come across, like Gondor and like Arthedain, which are very similar to Dol Amroth in the way that they're structured. We've already mentioned Rohan previously and how their units have got significantly lower manpower in this reserve, and that's not something that Dol Amroth falls into as much, but it is still worth mentioning because it is by these margins that you will probably be deciding how to structure your armies and your compositions, and it just goes to show the slightly lower priority of mainline units and defensive infantry that Dol Amroth have in comparison to their overlords. A little bit more of a focus around more aggressive units and sort of really hitting hard with some of those heavily armoured, more offensive units, more so than maybe sitting back in shape like the Gondorians do. Again, it's not the be-all and end-all, especially when you're considering these are only your most basic of units, but it is a difference that is worth mentioning. It is mainly as well something that comes down to the cavalry and the impacts that will have on your composition as a whole. Something they do have in common with Gondor, and many of the other Western kingdoms for that matter as well, is that they are vulnerable to armour piercing. Pretty much every unit in their roster is going to draw the lion's share of its defensive effectiveness from its armoured values, especially when you consider that Dol Amroth also have access to quite a few units that can upgrade their armour. It goes to reason then that armour piercing is going to be good against them pretty much across the board. Certainly when it comes to their most effective units and the heart and soul of their army, armour piercing is going to be one way that you can really establish yourself against Dol Amroth, be that against their cavalry or on foot, especially on foot you would suggest, given some of the other potential pitfalls that you can run into while playing as Dol Amroth. But this is true, like I said, of many of the Western kingdoms, and it's something we will be mentioning again as we go through some of the other kingdoms to the far west and the north as well. But something else that is worth mentioning as Dol Amroth is the fact that they have pretty expensive army compositions. Now, again, we mentioned this with the cavalry. Cavalry tends to result in more expensive compositions overall, and while this is true with cavalry-heavy armies like Rohan and Khand as well, they are much more designed around having, almost cavalry-only armies in some situations. They're designed for that to be viable, whereas that's not really true with Dol Amroth. You are intended to have your cavalry and then have infantry around it and it to work together in tandem, and that can be the case on the open field or in a siege as well. It's not as much of a problem there, cost, as it is with a faction like the Elves or the Dwarves, for example, where expensive units are pretty much the order of the day, and combating that is pretty much the main obstacle between you and victory. With Dol Amroth, it's not quite to that point, in the same way that the lower than average numbers is not quite to the point of it being on the same level as, for example, the Rohirrim infantry or the Elves that we're talking about with regards to the expense now. But it is still worth talking about in comparison to the most direct comparisons as factions go, like Gondor and Arthedain, even Dale to a certain extent further northwards. These are all going to be factions with similar costs across the board, but Dol Amroth tend to be a little bit more, because you're going to be spending a little bit more on cavalry. You're going to have to rely on some of your higher quality units to really toe the line when it comes to doing the business in melee with regards to their infantry. Slightly lower numbers in that regard as well, so they are more of a quality focused faction than many of the other Western Kingdoms. Again, based on Dol Amroth's backstory, that's not the most surprising thing in the world. But I think it's probably best if we went to the grassy plain now and actually had a look at some of these things up close and personal, and had a look at what Dol Amroth actually have to offer on an individual basis. So once again, with Dol Amroth, we're going to have to split things between categories of units, so we'll be talking about the all-important cavalry and what artillery they have available to them. In a separate section here, it's going to be purely the infantry and the ranged units on foot that we will be looking at here. And much like their overlords in Gondor, they have a rather front-loaded looking roster in this respect, with, a lot of armour upgrades going to be involved in here, though. Not quite to the same extent as the Gondorians in some respects, but still very, very similar, albeit they are a little bit thinner on the ground just in behind, with only a few units available on each tier, in fact single units available outside of their more basic ones, but this is because they have a more extensive cavalry lineup than a few of the other Western Kingdoms, as we'll talk about in a moment. But for here, we will talk about some of their basic units first and foremost, starting off with something which many of the human kingdoms could not be without, which is a standard unit of line infantry, the Dol Amroth men-at-arms, a simple sword and shield kind of unit, reasonably well priced as well at 475, as much as Dol Amroth's armies overall tend to be quite expensive in comparison to their peers. It's not as a result of their basic units, it must be said. But like I said, in the build-up to this, they do have slightly fewer men per unit than the equivalent Gondorian or Arthedanian kind of unit in this way. But they can upgrade them twice in much the same way as many of the other Western Kingdoms, with the first being a breastplate and a little bit of extra chainmail added to them. And as is the way with many of the other Western Kingdoms as well, once you get up to the fully upgraded version, they get full plate. And this does increase their total defense to 23. This is loaded onto the armor, which, depending on which one of these is the dominant stat, it will have certain strengths and weaknesses. As we've said with armor, and as we said in the build-up, it's more easy to counteract with specialist units. Armor-piercing damage is going to be more effective against pretty much the entirety of the Dol Amroth roster anyway. But if you can upgrade the armor, if you do have that little bit of extra in reserve in terms of your funds, then it is well worth doing, because each one of these units individually gains access to the benefit of having that stronger armor, and ultimately survivability with when it comes to men-at-arms style units like this is the main thing that you're going for. They're not going to be match-winning units necessarily. I mean, an attack of 7 isn't too bad, it's not too high. Again, you were looking more at the defensive stats as being the thing which does stand out. Shield value of 7 is nice, especially when you've got fully upgraded armor like here. When you bolster it up to 10, it does make them a good tar pit when it comes to absorbing the damage from archers from a long way off. Defensive skill is on the lower side, however, so again, that armor is going to be the main thing which keeps them alive in a more slog-like melee engagement, shall we say. Also, Gondor do have access to the armor upgrade discount, which Dol Amroth do not have, so that is worth bearing in mind as well. Moving on, in a very similar vein, many of the Western Kingdoms also have an equivalent spear unit. They have a slightly lower man count than the swordsman, but it's not quite the same fall-off that some of the other Western Kingdoms have. But again, in a similar vein to the Rohirrim, I think this is more a result of the fact that the mainline infantry unit has a lower man count. 500, again, you have the bonus fighting cavalry as well. Pretty much the difference between the spearmen and the men-at-arms is as you would expect. The spearmen are going to be better when it comes to digging into a defensive formation and better at keeping themselves alive. The spear malus is in effect here once again, so the attack is very low at 4, and that is further reduced by the fact that they have that lower attack against enemy infantry. But defensively they're good. They've still got the better attack animation that spears have, allowing them to stagger enemy units more easily. And their defensive scores are good as well. Defensive skill, again, 5 is relatively low. The shield value is relatively good, however. And once again, the armor will be upgraded in the same fashion where you have, first of all, the breastplate and extra chain, and then finally you have the same unit model here as well for the full plate. And seeing as spears are a more defensively minded unit anyway, anything you can do to bolster their defensive values is going to be better for you. Of course, as is the case with most spear units, they can also make shield walls, so a nice formation which is very situational, but it's better to have it than not. And of course, the bonus fighting cavalry means they can also be good on the flank and at supporting your own cavalry if they're nearby on the open field in a battle like this. Now then, the most significant unit perhaps of the basic rank and file infantry units that DOL AMROTH have available to them are the halberdiers, because as I've mentioned, they have lost access to the pikes, albeit the halberdiers are a little bit cheaper than they used to be, and they're pretty much the same kind of unit with the same kind of effectiveness that they were before. You can see that they can form phalanx, which is going to be important because when it comes to digging in and trying to make your infantry as efficient as possible, if you do get forced onto the defensive with your infantry, which is not beyond the realms of possibility because of the slightly lower numbers that you're probably going to have as a result of focusing a bit more on your cav, you're going to need to rely on something at least to give you that anchoring point and to make you a little bit more efficient up close. Polearms are the easiest way that you can do that, and the halberdiers are DOL AMROTH's only option there. The armour-piercing attacks are also going to be useful, against certain foes more than others admittedly, but again, better to have it than not. Of course, they don't have the range of pikes, which can be a problem, but DOL AMROTH have got other tools for dealing with pikes. Effectiveness against armour we've already mentioned. Of course, they have a bonus against cavalry. The stats, as with most polearm units, it's kind of difficult to quantify these guys. They don't have a shield value at all, which does differentiate them from the likes of Rune's halberds and Dale's halberds as well. It does make them a little bit more vulnerable in that respect than those units, but to slightly make up for that, they have got the same two-tiered armour upgrade system with the breastplates, and then with the full plate, which across the board will give you an armour score of 10 if you go up to the silver level, which will help you against projectiles, but the lack of a shield is still a problem, of course. But the attacking benefits of halberdiers do tend to be useful in quite a few situations. They're a little bit better as well when it comes to trying to take advantage of chaotic advances, which DOL AMROTH could very well find themselves enacting quite a lot, because cavalry does tend to break open a battle, especially on the open field, a little bit more often than not, and halberdiers do tend to perform well in those situations, more so than pikes. But yeah, probably the best defensive infantry unit that you have available to you, and also a point of difference to many of the other Western kingdoms, specifically the Númenórean ones, or ones with Númenórean influence anyway, because those tend to have pikes, and those also tend to have maybe a few axemen for their armour-piercing melee option. Not the case with DOL AMROTH, they have halberds. Now then, moving up to the other tiers, of which I've separated them into three because they do tend to, they are very distinct in terms of what they offer. We mentioned the heavy swordsman in the build-up being the most domineering part of DOL AMROTH's melee infantry force, and that is certainly true, the Perithil champions being the first example of that. You can see the very impressive stats that they have available to them. 123 means there's not that many of them. It's very similar in many ways to what you would expect from an elven faction, albeit there is a slightly different distribution of stats. Like the defensive skill is still very high at 17, but you would expect slightly more from the equivalent elven unit. However, many of the elven factions also don't roll into battle with quite the same level of armour as DOL AMROTH, so there is that does help boost them up a little bit, an armour score of 11, which does mean they're going to be a little bit more resilient to projectiles as well, but again, the lack of a shield means that they're certainly not going to be very good at absorbing range damage. It's more just the case that they're not quite as bad. And then the attacking stats as well. Attack of 18, charge bonus of 15 if you're able to land it, means that you're going to be doing plenty of damage, combined with the defensive prowess that this unit tends to provide you as well. It means that you're going to stay standing far longer than the equivalent, say, of Axeman of Lasarnak, which would be Gondor's main option for this sort of thing. I'm comparing them to Gondor a lot, but it is the best comparison really to explain what DOL AMROTH are good at and what they're not so good at. But the Axeman of Lasarnak will fall away very quickly because they've got low melee defense, and just in general their defensive abilities across the board are not quite as good. Perithil champions will do more, higher base damage and keep themselves alive better, but they lack the armour-piercing edge that unit has. 750 is not too bad either, and they inspire nearby troops and frighten nearby enemy infantry. And as DOL AMROTH, you want to keep your basic units in front of these guys, fighting for as long as possible. The fear effect is very useful for a unit of this cost as well, and quite rare outside of bodyguard units or specialist troops. Now then, Not a bodyguard unit as such, I would suggest, at least in comparison. I've given them their own tier. You could see them used as a bodyguard unit, but the Talon Knights also don't have the red limit immediately. You can bring more than one, which is a point of differentiation, I suppose. They inspire nearby troops, but they do not cause fear, which is interesting, but they are more of a defensive unit, and it's more useful for this kind of unit to have access to the inspiration. The main thing is, of course, they have 2 hit points. They're very expensive for a unit that you would be basing your army around at 1,000. Good stats across the board, of course, 15, total defense of 28, split evenly between armour and defensive skill, and also they come equipped with that shield, of course, so decent. I mean, among this kind of unit, they probably have similar stats actually to something like the Uruk Chieftains over in Mordor, albeit they're intended to be a more singular bodyguard unit as opposed to the Talon Knights where you might see more than one. The main thing, of course, is the fact that they are mace men. They will dish out armour-piercing attacks, and considering their base attack is 15, they're not actually sacrificing too much in terms of their baseline stats in order to be able to deliver that damage. The main issue with them is their cost and the fact that there aren't that many of them, but they can be a pretty dangerous accent on your front line, and they do give you that armour-piercing that DOL AMROTH otherwise would be entirely reliant on ranged units, cavalry and their halberds. They wouldn't really have a unit that could be used a little bit more freely in melee, but the Talon Knights do provide that, albeit quite expensive option for that. But yeah, interesting. This is the kind of unit that you don't see too often crop up, and they do provide something different for DOL AMROTH. I couldn't list it as a unique strength of the faction, really, considering the other things that DOL AMROTH have going for them, but this is something nice that you can weave into your army, and particularly against armoured forces, they may bite off more than they can chew as a result of the quality. But when it comes to sheer quality, one of the very best units of heavy swordsmen the game has to offer. Not the best, I don't think. There are a couple of others that do have access to that 3rd hit point and maybe a few better stats than the Haven Guard of Athalon, but they're right up there, almost certainly still within the top 5, and this is really where DOL AMROTH, obviously, this is the pride and soul of their infantry force. And as with most heavy swordsmen, in terms of sheer numbers, in terms of stats, they're going to post up the highest ones with 24 attack, again the charge bonus of 15. The armour and defensive skill combination is nice, and it does differentiate them a little bit from something like the Noldoran Blade Masters that we saw recently. 2 hit points, 1,250 is actually not too unreasonable. There are a couple of other infantry units that do cost a little bit more, but then those tend to be the ones that push into that 3rd hit point. They also have the fear effect back, which is understandable for a more shock infantry style unit, albeit the general is probably going to be in this unit more often than not, especially if DOL AMROTH are defending in a siege. Yeah, not too different to the other examples of this kind of unit that we've seen before, but again, in comparison to something like the Noldoran, they're going to come with all the strengths and weaknesses of what you would expect from DOL AMROTH, in the sense that they will have lower defensive skill than an Elven unit like that, though they will do better than other equivalent units from other factions that we'll see at later dates. Armour score, however, does boost them up a little bit. That heavy armour that DOL AMROTH do traffic in helps them in that regard. Big damage as well. Now then, moving across to the ranged units, and we will start off with something very similar to what we started off with the basic infantry, which is the DOL AMROTH archers, and all of them can deploy stakes, which is nice. That's not a given with all basic archers. Some of them lack that ability, so it's worth pointing that out. But once again, we have the regular version. You can upgrade them to have the breastplate, and then you can have the full plate offering as well, which I would recommend. I mean, the armour score for these guys is slightly lower than the equivalent infantry. Those guys have 10. If you upgrade the armour fully, these guys have 8. 550 is relatively low cost. Obviously in melee they're not particularly great, but you don't expect that from basic human archers anyway. The best thing they can offer you in melee really is, especially when they're fully upgraded, their defensive ability to stand in the way and take blows that would have otherwise hit other units. But from afar, missile attack of 5 is in line with what you'd expect from the human faction, sort of sitting in the middle nicely of the slightly more damaging elves and the slightly less damaging orcs, and more evil men factions as well have some basic archers that only do 4 damage. But what you would expect from this kind of unit is good ability to trade with enemy archers in a long skirmishing fight. And the DOL AMROTH archers, especially when you upgrade their armour, are very capable of doing that in the same way that the Gondor archers were. There are factions which are going to be more comfortable in long-range skirmishing than DOL AMROTH, but the list is shorter than the opposite. DOL AMROTH, if you bring the full archer lineup that you are capable of doing, then you will find yourself in a more comfortable situation than many other factions in the game, if that is the way the battle is going, especially with the mobility that Dol Amroth can also field. As efficient as you can be on foot, it's going to be elsewhere that you win the battle, but the fact that you're able to fight in this respect as well as you can opens up those possibilities for you. However, this is perhaps the more significant unit now. The Belfalas Marines, in terms of their stats, are not particularly amazing in terms of what you would expect to see. Again, in terms of their melee abilities, they are better than the archers, and you would expect that. I mean, they are intended to, if push comes to shove, act as a lighter infantry unit that can fight on the front lines, pulling out that axe. Again, melee attack of 6 is not particularly high, charge bonus of 3. The defensive scores are not terrible. Again, the armour is not quite as heavy as it is elsewhere in the faction, and the defensive skill isn't either because of the choice of weapon. They do have a shield, but it's a relatively low shield value, so you still don't want them getting cut up by really high tier archers, which is a possibility when it comes to trying to counteract javelins. Missile attack of 7, I mean, as far as the cost efficiency goes, these guys are pretty good. 500 is relatively low, puts them in line with what a few of the other really low-end javelins can do, albeit these guys can look after themselves a little bit more easily. Lower numbers perhaps than something like the Orcs. But what really sets them apart is the fact that the red limit has been raised. Many other factions for basic javelins can only bring 2 before the red limit kicks in. Some can do 3, very few can do 4 in the way that Dol Amroth can, and that's why I think you'll see quite a lot more of these guys, especially if Dol Amroth are in a siege situation. They'll probably bring the full complement because it's a really good defensive tool. As we've seen in the past, it's a very effective offensive tool as well. On the open field, I think you'll probably see a more conservative approach with this unit, because ultimately if you bring 4 of them, you know, that is still a big portion of your army, and ultimately these guys come with very distinct weaknesses. If you're going to be very aggressive, you might still see it, but yeah, it's not often that you'll see a faction with a red limit that high on a unit of this type, and I think it is an earnest attempt to give Dol Amroth an option when it comes to breaking open phalanx units or digging in, that sort of thing, where otherwise they wouldn't have it, but also an attempt to differentiate them a bit more from Gondor, whereas in the past, Dol Amroth's ranged force was pretty much the same thing, only worse in every respect. Now with this, they have something completely different, really. However, something which is very similar to other units of its type throughout the game are the Dol Amroth Rangers. The Rangers of Nimrodel, 800 is pretty standard fare for what you would expect a unit like this to cost, and also the stats in general and what they can do are pretty standard fare, especially among the human Rangers. They have decent melee stats. You know, a melee attack of 10 is actually pretty damn good for a unit of this type. I think it's slightly higher actually than the average that we've seen so far. The total defense is of course propped up massively by the defensive skill, which can be good if it comes down to a late game melee engagement purely, which is the only time you should really be committing Rangers to the fight anyway. Missile attack of 9 is also nice, it's slightly higher, so again it's a sign that perhaps they have a little bit of that elven lineage still in them, that they are probably better compared to units of this type, something like the Wardens of Elos Tyrion or the Sylvan Elf Rangers that we've yet to see. So they do have that going for them, and they are a very damaging unit, and most Rangers are Rangers of Nimrodel, slightly more than the average. However, they come with all of the same caveats that a unit of Rangers has. The armour values are very low. If they come out of hiding and enemy archers see them, they're going to be one of the first targets, because the danger of letting them run amok on the field unopposed is too great for the opposition in many situations. But still, as much as they don't have their body-piercing projectiles anymore, they have proven themselves to still be one of the key cornerstones of defending forces in a siege, if they can bring them. On the open field or on the attack in a siege, they can be a little bit more difficult to use, but still, their ability to snipe out targets with that high damage should not be underestimated. Now then, we shall move on to perhaps the most significant part of Dol Amroth's army, which is the cavalry. We'll also take a look at their siege as well. So a good selection of cavalry, not as much as the Rohirrim, but still higher than many of the forces that we've seen previously. And as far as their melee cavalry force goes, or I say melee cavalry, lance and sword cavalry force goes, they have a regular option and a bodyguard option for both, all heavy cavalry. This is where the vast majority of their strength lies as well. They do have access to some ranged cavalry as well, but again, a smaller variety there, and it does go to show where Dol Amroth really do prioritise. And this is probably one of the unique cases where the most basic unit of cavalry they have to offer in the standard Swan Knights is probably my favourite looking of all of the DOL AMROTH cavalry, weirdly enough. The Swan Knights, of course, have been involved in the game ever since vanilla in one form or another, albeit their unit model has moved up in many ways since then, in my opinion. This is probably one of the best looking units in the game. Maybe even my single favourite looking unit model in the game, honestly. But with regards to what they actually offer as a Lance unit, it's more or less what you would expect, albeit there are a couple of things which really do set the Swan Knights apart. One is, of course, the defensive value, where you have that combination of armour and shield, which means that they're going to be able to withstand pressure from afar and up close a little bit better than some more flimsy units of cavalry. Perhaps we've already gone over a couple of forces that have access to some lighter cavalry, like the Serpent Guard of Harad, for example. They do still have that inspiration effect, albeit they don't have a fear effect, which is interesting, which would be far more useful for this kind of unit for all the reasons we've mentioned in previous faction overviews, where the inspiration effect is only going to be useful if you're near units that it would affect, and cavalry needs to keep moving to get the best out of it. Effective against armour off the charge, and it is the charge which the Swan Knights do differentiate themselves a little bit from other basic Lancers. Charge bonus of 20. Which is the full Monty when it comes to charge bonuses, and it just, again, hammers home that this is DOL AMROTH's focus. This is where they are at their strongest, because many other factions, their basic Lancers especially, would only have access to a charge bonus of 15, and that does make a difference. It means if you do clatter into enemy infantry, especially armoured infantry, they are going to fold more quickly. And when you consider that this is a unit which is reasonably numerous, you know, many other forces that have a charge bonus of 20, and we'll see in a minute, they tend to be bodyguard units, and these units are smaller. So if all of these guys hit, it's going to be devastating off the charge. So a very, very nice unit. Big fan of them. However, a big part of cavalry engagements also tends to be how well you can deal horse to horse, and the Parathil Horse Guard are the main unit that DOL AMROTH will be utilising when it comes to that sort of combat. Wielding a two-handed sword, melee cavalry through and through, they have that bonus fighting cavalry, and because it's a two-handed sword as well, it means that their base attack is pretty damn good as well. So they're going to perform very, very nicely in melee against especially other basic units of cavalry. But when it comes to really asserting themselves in melee against other cavalry forces, they can also go toe-to-toe with units that might cost a little bit more than them, especially if you combine them with the bodyguard equivalent, which we'll talk about in a moment. Good defensive skill as well as a result of that. The shield value maybe is a little bit lower, but again, cavalry, because of its manoeuvrability, you don't have to lean on that shield value eating a bunch of arrow fire quite as much as you would for an equivalent unit on foot. So I don't think that's too much of a problem. But of course the charge bonus is far lower, because melee cavalry, while they still can charge in and do a decent amount of damage because of the mass, ultimately it's not going to be as devastating as the other units that wield lances. Speaking of which, we have the Lance Cavalry Bodyguard unit, which used to be a weirdly monstrous unit, and it still kind of is in many ways. 1600 is a big cost. It's the most expensive unit of this type that we've seen so far, and when you look at some of these stats, you can definitely see why. The charge bonus of 20, they do have the fear effect as well, so that is something. They have a bonus fighting cavalry, which differentiates them from the regular Lancers of the Swan Knights that are just in front of them. Charge bonus of 20 still. The total defense of 45, and a lot of that is because of the defensive skill, which is huge. I mean, I haven't gone through it one-to-one just yet. We'll be doing that after all the faction overviews are over, but it's very possible that the Arathirium could still be the best unit of Lance Knights in the game. But now you do pay for that, because 1600 is a very large outlay indeed. And it's the combination of huge armour and huge defensive skill. Still got that shield as well, but ultimately these units will all do the same sort of thing. It's just the standard to which they will do it will slightly vary. The Arathirium, one of, if not the very best in the business. Pure melee might be an area where, in terms of their sheer damage, because their attack is only 8, they might come unstuck against certain opposition, but fantastic at what they do. And when it comes to sheer melee anyway, these are the guys that you're going to be utilising. The Haven Knights of Athalond, 1500, so a bargain in comparison. But they are also pure cavalry hunters, really. They don't have the fear effect, but they still inspire nearby troops, which is slightly more useful for melee cav, because they're going to be involved in the pits a little bit more than Lance Cavalry will. Attack of 16, of course, again. Stats very high, total defense still high at 39, albeit the armour, the defensive skill, a little bit lower, interestingly enough, but it is the bonus fighting cavalry where they will really come alive. Sword cavalry like this often does. So if you are wanting to be a little bit more defensive with your cav, then the Haven Knights are probably the way to go. If you want to be more aggressive, obviously the Arathiran are the way to go. That is really the choice you have to make. You could bring all of them, including the units just in front of them, but that would make your army tiny, and the risk probably wouldn't pay off overall. You know, I think you will have to decide more or less whether you want to go for some sort of hybrid approach, or whether you go for a really dedicated approach of melee cav or lance cav, because of the costs involved, and we mentioned that at the start of the video. Here we have the one unit of range cavalry that Dol Amroth have at their disposal, the Perithil Horse Archers, which, as far as horse archers go, they're pretty much exactly what you would expect. They are a relatively, well, a slightly lower numbers perhaps than you would like for this kind of unit. Horse archer unit which do decent damage and also have decent armour as well in comparison. The main difference is going to be against horse archer focused factions. You're not going to be able to bring as many of these as your opposition, so there is a time and a place for bringing the Perithil, kind of similar perhaps to the Riders of the Broinen that we've already seen before. Again, going to be reliant on that armour, no shield value to speak of. As with all horse archers really, foot archers are going to be the bane of their existence if you can't get in and around them and cause a bit of chaos first before your harassment can start. 750 is pretty par for the course for these guys as well, so there's nothing too out of the ordinary to speak about other than the standard Dol Amroth focuses of boosting that armour up a little bit, with all of the other caveats that come with that. Decent defensive skill. I mean, they can look after themselves well enough in melee to survive for one of the melee cavalry units to come and give them a hand, and that can be all of the difference that is needed when it comes to a fast-paced cavalry engagement. Now then, something which we will not be seeing the end of is the Trebuchet of Numenor. We're going to be seeing these guys in a few other factions, albeit with different colour schemes. With Dol Amroth, it is the blue. They have that armour-piercing warhammer in melee, which makes them actually the only example of an armour-piercing shock infantry unit Dol Amroth have. But of course the main attraction with this is going to be the Trebuchet itself. 1200 is a lot as well, especially for a faction which is going to be spending a lot of money elsewhere like Dol Amroth are. But yeah, I think a Trebuchet, it's got that really high-end killing power, but it's also a risk. It's the opposite of the Ballista in that respect, where the Ballista is always going to be at least somewhat useful. The Trebuchet can be utterly useless, and then it's flushed away a decent amount of value that this unit can have, albeit the crew themselves are also capable of doing a decent amount too now. So yeah, it's not the last that we've seen of this unit, not the Trebuchet nor the crew. I think Arthedain and Unbar have also got access to that unit, but there we wrap up Dol Amroth, which, to be honest, I wouldn't say this for sure, but Dol Amroth may very well be my personal favourite in the game, just because of the style of them. I've never been particularly good with cavalry, to be honest, so it's certainly not because of how they play, but I think just stylistically, lore-wise, they were always my favourite part of Gondor, and yeah, I've really got quite a soft spot for them. Clear weaknesses, but I think their strengths are also very well defined, perhaps more so than many other forces in the game. It's a very, very clear strength indeed. So, we shall move on now to the next faction overview, and we'll have to go back to another evil faction. So, I mean, I suppose, you know, it's a loose link, I suppose, but in terms of armour focuses and somewhat close geographically, albeit there is a mountain range in the way, another very iconic faction in the game will be returning to an Orcish faction now, and I think we'll do Isengard next. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for that.